When I got the call from my neighbor that the sheriff's deputy was at our lake cabin, my first thought was, what the hell did Karen do now? Karen Whitmore, yes, that Karen. HOA president for the Lakewood Pines Cabins Association, self-declared enforcer of everything from mailbox paint tones to how loudly you open your car door. She had a permanent frown carved into her face and a clipboard that could snap steel. My wife, Valencia, had taken our daughter Gracie up to the cabin for the weekend while I wrapped up a few things in town. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway on the lake, just girls' time. But apparently, Valencia made the critical mistake of changing the lock on our own gate. That's when Karen called 911. I drove the 2 hours up from Maple Ridge in record time. When I pulled into our gravel driveway, I saw the sheriff's cruiser parked beside our cabin and Karen standing with her arms crossed like she was posing for a mugshot of pride. Valencia was calm, holding our daughter's hand. Gracie looked confused, clutching her stuffed turtle. The deputy turned to me as I stepped out of my truck. "You Mr. Prescott Zeller?" "Yeah," I said. "What's going on?" Karen stepped forward like she owned the damn place. "Your wife tampered with shared property. That gate is HOA controlled. She changed the lock without board approval. That's considered vandalism and possible trespassing." Valencia's voice was steady. "It's our private gate, Karen. It sits entirely on our lot. The property line runs past it." I checked the county plat and had it confirmed by the assessor's office last month. Karen barked a humorless laugh. "Oh please, that gate has always been under HOA jurisdiction. It's in the handbook." The deputy raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I've looked at the property map. This gate's well within the Zellers' boundary. There's no shared access here." Karen's mouth twitched. "Well then, it's an outdated map. The bylaws supersede that." "No, ma'am," the deputy said. "They don't. County records override HOA guidelines." I could see Karen's jaw clench so hard her forehead twitched. She turned to me like I was the one who just rewired her brain. "You're not getting away with this. You people think you can move in and do whatever you want. That gate affects aesthetics." "It's visible from the lake path." "It's a black iron gate," I said. "It looks exactly the same. We just changed the lock because someone's been opening it without permission." Valencia pulled out a folder and handed it to the deputy. "We installed a camera last month. There's footage of Karen entering our property 3 separate times without consent." The deputy flipped through the printed stills. "You have timestamps." "Yep," Valencia said. "And we filed a trespass notice with the county 2 weeks ago." That shut Karen up for a full 5 seconds an eternity in Karen time. Then she snapped. "This is harassment. You're targeting me because I'm doing my job." The deputy closed the folder. "No one asked you to act like private security. I suggest you leave the property before I issue a citation." Karen's face turned a shade redder than her lipstick. "This isn't over." "No," I said, locking eyes with her. "It's just getting started." I waited until the deputy drove off before turning to Valencia, who was already on her way back toward the cabin with Gracie. The little one was chattering about frogs and skipping rocks like nothing had happened, which told me Valencia had kept her calm through the whole ordeal. She always carried herself like someone who'd been through worse and knew how to handle worse still. I followed them up the porch steps, the fresh wood creaking under my boots. I'd installed those myself last summer, and looking at them now, I was reminded of just how much sweat we'd poured into making this place ours. Valencia had already pulled out her laptop and was plugging in the flash drive with the camera footage. I poured us both some coffee and sat beside her. "She's not going to let this go," Valencia said, eyes still on the screen. "I don't think she even cares about the gate. She's trying to provoke us," I said. "Looking for anything to file a complaint over. She wants us to react." Valencia clicked through the footage, zooming in on a clip from a week ago. There was Karen standing at the gate, clipboard in hand, staring into our lot for what had to be 10 minutes straight. She hadn't entered that time, just stood there, watching like she was waiting for something to happen. "She's been logging our comings and goings," she said. I found a note stuck under the mailbox last week. Said our trash bins were misaligned with community standards. She's escalating. That's stalking, I said, and if she's been tracking us without cause, we can file for a protection order. Valencia nodded slowly but didn't say anything. She was staring at a frame from 2 nights ago. What's that? I asked. She rewound the footage. There it was again, someone around midnight standing just beyond the tree line near the back of the lot. The figure didn't move toward the cabin, didn't approach the gate, just stood there, watching. Zoom in, I said. She enhanced the image, adjusted the contrast. The shape was too far off to make out a face, but the height, posture, it wasn't Karen. This person was taller, male maybe, wearing a hoodie. I didn't see this before, she said. I was only checking the gate footage. Looks like we're not just dealing with Karen anymore. The next morning, I drove into town and met with a lawyer named Nadia Greaves. She came highly recommended by a friend from the city council. She specialized in property law and had a reputation for dismantling overreaching HOAs one clause at a time. After I explained everything gate, trespassing, the footage, the midnight visitor, she leaned back in her chair and tapped her pen twice on the desk. HOAs are not law enforcement, she said. They can't enforce criminal statutes. They have no authority to enter private land without permission, and they certainly can't dictate what you do with your own gate if it's on your legal property. But here's the twist: if they try to enforce non-existent authority. That's abuse of power. She pulled a thick binder from the shelf and flipped to a tab labeled Precedent. I'll file a cease and desist today. We'll also request a restraining order if she steps foot on your property again. And if her actions suggest coordinated surveillance or harassment, I'll have grounds to petition the county for an emergency injunction. And the footage? I asked. She nodded. We'll submit that as evidence, but I want to go further. I want to see their books. That caught me off guard. Their books? HOAs collect dues. They're supposed to keep transparent records. If she's misusing funds, say, hiring private security without approval or misappropriating money for aesthetic enforcement, we can subpoena the financials. Mismanagement of communal funds is a Class C felony in this state if the amount exceeds $25,000. How do we trigger that? We find a paper trail. You need to talk to your neighbors, quietly. Ask if anyone's noticed weird charges, sudden spikes in dues, or off-the-books repairs. If we can show a pattern, I can get a judge to compel disclosure. Back at the cabin, I started making visits. Not door to door, not yet. I picked the ones I knew best, the ones who'd waved at us from across the lake or shared beers at last summer's fish fry. First was Aaron, a retired lineman with a bear-like handshake and a deep distrust of anything bureaucratic. I asked if he'd noticed anything strange with his dues. They went up 30% this year, he said. No explanation. Just a necessary adjustment to maintain community charm, whatever that means. Did you get an itemized breakdown? Nope, just a slip with a new total. Next was Tracy and Leo, a couple who owned a smaller cabin on the south end. They were cautious at first, but when I mentioned the phrase financial mismanagement, Leo leaned in. We paid for a new community dock last fall, he said, but the contractor never showed. Karen said he backed out. Took the deposit and vanished. You see any paperwork on that? Just a newsletter saying it was being handled internally. By the end of the week, I had notes from 11 residents, all had stories. Some had been fined for things that weren't even in the bylaws: unauthorized wind chimes, improper gravel coloration, even one for overly reflective window tint. Not one of them had received a detailed breakdown of where their dues were going. Nadia filed for a financial audit with the County Oversight Board and sent a formal complaint to the State HOA Regulatory Commission. But it was what happened 3 nights later that blew the whole thing wide open. At 2:17 a.m., our motion sensor lights snapped on. Valencia woke me with a hand on my shoulder. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed, but before I reached the front door, I heard the sound gravel crunching, fast footsteps, then a sharp metallic clang. I bolted out barefoot, bat in hand. The gate was hanging open, the lock busted clean off. Someone had used bolt cutters. I scanned the trees, but whoever it was had already vanished into the woods. Valencia pulled the footage. This time we got a clear face. It wasn't Karen. It was a man in his 40s, stocky, wearing a company jacket embroidered with LPCA Maintenance Division. We didn't have a maintenance division. There were no employees. The HOA had always contracted out its work. We gave the footage to Nadia, who passed it to the sheriff's office. They ran the plates from a truck seen earlier on the same camera registered to a company that hadn't existed for over 6 years. The address on file was a P.O. box in another county. By noon the next day, a warrant was issued. Turns out, Karen had been billing the HOA for maintenance services performed by this fake company over $35,000 in the last 12 months. The man in the footage, her nephew, a former contractor who'd lost his license after being caught siphoning gas from job sites. The sheriff's office raided Karen's house that afternoon. They found ledgers, fake invoices, and stacks of HOA checks made out to the fake company. She tried to claim ignorance, said she'd been duped, but the email chain between her and her nephew told a different story. The real shock, though, came when the county investigator found a section in the ledger labeled enforcement bonuses. Monthly payments small enough to avoid suspicion marked as community oversight funds. Each one went to Karen. She'd been paying herself to report violations she'd made up. I stood with Valencia and Gracie on our porch that evening, watching the sheriff's SUV disappear down the hill with Karen inside. The clipboard was nowhere in sight. Valencia turned to me, her voice low. She really thought no one would dig. She underestimated the wrong family, I said, wrapping my arm around her. The next morning, I found a folded note under the windshield wiper of my truck. It read, "Thank you, we've been waiting years for someone to stand up." No signature. Just a small, pressed flower tucked inside. By the following week, word of Karen's arrest had rippled across Lakewood Pines like a summer storm. You could feel it in the way people lingered a little longer outside the general store, in the sidelong glances shared between neighbors who'd spent years avoiding eye contact. Something had shifted. The unspoken grip the HOA board had held over the cabins for years had loosened, and folks were starting to realize they'd been walking around with their heads ducked for no good reason. I got a call from Nadia just after breakfast on Tuesday. She sounded energized, even for her. "They filed charges," she said. "Wire fraud, forgery, and misuse of public funds, that's 3 felonies. Her arraignment's next week, but that's not the big news." I stepped out onto the back deck and leaned on the railing. "I'm listening." The county investigator found something else in her files, a list, names, lot numbers, and a column labeled priority action. What kind of action? Property seizure through lien stacking. She'd been issuing fabricated fines, small at first, then escalating, and when residents couldn't pay, she'd stack them until the HOA claimed forfeiture rights. 4 cabins were already on the brink. That's extortion. Exactly, and illegal under state law. The board was supposed to review and approve every lien. But here's the kicker, there is no board, not legally. Only Karen's name appears on any filings from the past 3 years. The other members were either straw signers or never consented. I didn't say anything at first. I was staring out at the lake, wondering how many people had nearly lost their homes without even realizing the rules were fake. "She had a signature stamp," Nadia added. "Used it to forge approvals. We're talking about a years-long paper trail of fraud. We'll get those properties restored, but we need statements." "I'll get them," I said. By mid-afternoon, I'd spoken with the owners of 3 of the 4 cabins. The last belonged to an older veteran named Warren who lived up on the ridge. I'd seen him around before, always with a cane in one hand and a thermos in the other. But we'd never spoken more than a neighborly wave. When I knocked on his door, he opened it with a glance that said he wasn't expecting anyone, but wasn't surprised either. "You hear about Whitmore's racket?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He stepped aside and waved me in with a flick of his cane. His living room was neat, plain, and smelled like cedar. A stack of mail sat unopened on the coffee table. He motioned toward it. "She fined me $200 for a non-compliant roof angle, said my shingles caused glare. I laughed the first time. Then came the compound late fees." "You ever get a breakdown of those fees?" "Nope, just final notices. Said I owed over $6,000. I fought it, but every appeal got denied." Turns out she was the only one reviewing them. She filed a lien, sure did. Said if I didn't pay by August, they could initiate forfeiture. I'm on a fixed income. I was 2 weeks from selling just to keep ahead of it. I called Nadia from the porch. She put Warren on the list for immediate action. By the end of the day, the county had frozen every lien associated with the Lakewood Pines HOA pending investigation. The next morning, Valencia and I were invited to a closed-door meeting with the county prosecutor. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Kelly Rojas, laid out the full scope of what they'd uncovered. Karen had help, she said, clicking through a series of scanned documents on a wall-mounted screen. Her nephew handled the fake invoices and break-ins. But there's a second name on multiple transactions, a man named Gerald Phoenix. He filed incorporation documents for the fake maintenance company and funneled funds through 3 separate accounts. "Who is he?" I asked. "Former city treasurer. Resigned 5 years ago under suspicion of embezzlement. Charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. He moved out here last year and registered as a community consultant for the HOA. On paper, he had no authority, but we found his name on over a dozen purchase orders. And where is he now? Gone. Disappeared the night Karen was arrested. His cabin's cleaned out. We're issuing a warrant, but unless someone spots him, he's in the wind." That night, I walked the lake path with Valencia. The moon was out, casting long shadows across the water. Gracie was asleep back at the cabin, and for the first time in weeks, we didn't feel like we had to keep one eye on the tree line. "What happens to the HOA now?" she asked, picking up a small stick and tossing it into the brush. "It gets dismantled," I said. "The bylaws were never ratified properly. County oversight stepping in. They'll hold a hearing next month. If no one wants to rebuild it legally, it dissolves. There'll be people who want to keep it going. Probably. But they'll have to do it right this time. Transparent board, real elections, no secret contractors." She stopped walking and looked at me. "We should be at that hearing." "We will be." Over the next 2 weeks, the cabin community began to change. Neighbors who'd never spoken were suddenly comparing notes on fines, notices, and strange enforcement visits. Someone created a group message chain, an actual one, not the old HOA bulletin that Karen had run like a propaganda leaflet. People started organizing yard work days, shared tools, even traded leftover paint cans. One afternoon, Tracy and Leo hosted a barbecue on the dock that was never built. Half the neighborhood showed up. I brought a cooler and a folding table. Someone brought a Bluetooth speaker. No one talked about dues or violations. They talked about fishing, kids, weather, and the weird things raccoons did if your trash wasn't locked up. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Aaron tapped me on the shoulder and handed me a folder. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said. Inside were copies of emails between Karen and a local surveyor. They were dated over a year ago, long before she ever complained about our gate. "She tried to have your property line redrawn," he said. "Surveyor refused, said it was illegal unless the county ordered it. She threatened to report him to the state board. Where'd you get these?" His niece works at the diner, heard about what happened, asked if we needed help. I handed the folder to Nadia the next day. She added it to the growing list of evidence. By the time Karen's arraignment rolled around, the courtroom was standing room only. Residents lined the benches, some holding folders, others just there to watch. She entered in a beige suit, her hair pulled tight, flanked by 2 public defenders. She didn't look at anyone. The judge read the list of charges. She pled not guilty, Bail was denied. Outside, Warren stood on the steps, leaning on his cane. He watched as the officers led her back into custody. "She was never gonna stop," he said. "No," I said, "but we did." That night, I got another note. No flower this time, just a short line written in careful block letters. "Let's build something better." And for the first time since we bought the cabin, I believed we actually could. 2 weeks after Karen's arraignment, the County Oversight Board held the emergency hearing to determine the fate of the Lakewood Pines Cabins Association. It was conducted in the multipurpose hall of the Township Courthouse, an old brick building with sun-faded drapes and the kind of acoustics that made every cough sound like a gunshot. The community showed up in force. Not just cabin owners, but former residents, town officials, even a few reporters who'd caught wind of the story after the charges went public. The front row included Valencia, our daughter Gracie coloring quietly beside her, and the owners of the 4 properties that Karen had almost stolen through lien manipulation. Presiding over the hearing was a board of 3 officials from the county's Regulatory Compliance Office, flanked by a court-appointed auditor and an attorney from the state's fraud unit. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested this was going to be a slap on the wrist. One of the officials, a broad-shouldered woman named Eleanor Voss, stood and addressed the crowd. "We're here today to determine whether the Lakewood Pines Cabins Association may continue to operate under its current charter, and whether its leadership has violated state statutes governing homeowners associations. We will also review findings from the financial audit and criminal investigation." She gestured toward the large easel beside her, where a blown-up flowchart had been pinned. It tracked over 24 transactions from the HOA's accounts, red arrows pointing to forged invoices, false reimbursements, and shell companies. At the bottom was a signature line that appeared on every document. "K. Whitmore," Eleanor continued, her voice sharp and deliberate. "Our auditors have discovered substantial financial discrepancies totaling over $74,000 over a span of 18 months. None of these transactions were approved through proper procedure. All bear forged or unauthorized signatures." Leo stood up, voice shaking slightly. "I'd like to ask a question. If we hadn't caught her, would the county have done anything?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Not unless someone filed a formal complaint with supporting evidence. Most HOAs operate independently and the county doesn't interfere unless fraud is suspected." "So we were just stuck," Leo said, sitting down again. "You were until someone documented the crimes," Eleanor said. Then she looked directly at me. I didn't say anything, but Valencia reached over and gave my hand a squeeze under the table. The hearing continued with testimonies. Warren spoke about the pressure tactics. Karen used thinly veiled threats about community image and compliance expectations. Tracy described the emotional damage of almost selling their cabin to cover a lien they later found out was fabricated. Aaron presented a copy of the original plat map that Karen tried to illegally revise, but the most unexpected testimony came from a man no one recognized at first. He introduced himself clearly, though. "My name is Curtis Leland. I used to be a notary public. Karen approached me 2 years ago and asked me to verify signatures on HOA documents. At first, I believed they were legitimate board approvals. But over time, she started bringing me pre-signed forms dozens at a time. She paid me in cash and said the board didn't want to waste time with meetings." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "Did you report this?" "I didn't know how deep it went," Curtis said. "Not until I saw her name in the paper last week. I came forward to cooperate fully." The room fell silent as the board conferred. Then Eleanor turned to face the community again. "As of this moment, the charter for the Lakewood Pines Cabins Association is hereby revoked. All powers previously held by the board are suspended until further notice. The County Oversight Office will appoint a temporary trustee to handle administrative tasks while a voluntary community council is formed." There wasn't applause. No one knew if it was appropriate, but the collective exhale was louder than any cheer. After the hearing, as people filed out into the hallway, Kelly Rojas from the county investigation team approached me. She handed me a sealed envelope. "We found something else," she said. During a search of Karen's residence, we uncovered private correspondence between her and her brother-in-law, the same one who acted as her fake contractor. But these weren't just emails about maintenance, there were plans to expand. Expand? She wanted to annex 3 adjacent properties not currently part of the HOA. She'd already drafted letters threatening code violations if they didn't voluntarily join. It's a violation of coercion laws under the state's HOA governance code. Were the property owners notified? They are now. We've launched a separate investigation. If those letters had gone out, she could have forced those owners into dues and fines they never agreed to. We're listing it as attempted fraud. Valencia joined us, her expression unreadable. How many people knew? Just her and her brother-in-law, but we're learning she kept meticulous notes. That's what's going to put her away. By the end of the month, Karen was indicted on 2 additional charges of attempted fraud and coercion. Her total list of charges reached 9 felonies. Her attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor refused to drop the more serious charges related to property seizure and forgery. The trial was scheduled for early fall. By then, the transformation around Lakewood Pines was undeniable. The cabins that had once kept to themselves now shared tools, groceries, and even childcare. Someone organized a Saturday morning cleanup, and half the community showed up despite the heat. The old bulletin board by the dock was replaced with a hand-painted one featuring a simple message: "Neighbors first." The temporary community council was formed with 6 volunteers. Valencia was one of them. She didn't want to lead, just ensure things were done fairly. They agreed on one rule before forming any bylaws: no fines without a unanimous vote and written consent from the affected resident. Warren donated a set of solar lights for the path after someone tripped that spring. Leo offered to help fix the dock using leftover materials from his own porch. No one asked for compensation, no one needed approval from a board. They just did it. One evening, as we sat around the fire pit we'd finally built with permission from no one, Tracy pulled out a small wooden box. "I've got something," she said with a grin. "Found it in the back of the shed." Thought it might be fitting. She opened it to reveal Karen's infamous clipboard, the same one she used to terrorize the neighborhood with violation slips and compliance notes. Someone had burned the word "retired" into the cover with a wood-burning pen. "I say we mount it on the dock," Aaron suggested. Everyone laughed. "But upside down," Valencia said, raising her coffee mug. She got a chorus of agreements. That night, after the fire burned low and most had headed back to their cabins, I stayed behind with Gracie as she counted the stars. Valencia sat beside me, her knees pulled up and a blanket over her shoulders. "You think it'll last?" she asked. "Depends," I said. "If people remember what it felt like to be heard instead of ruled." She nodded slowly, watching our daughter draw constellations in the air with a stick. "I didn't expect it to turn out like this." "Neither did Karen," I said. And just like that, the lake was quiet again, not because people were afraid to speak, but because they didn't have to raise their voices anymore.